Okay, are you guys ready to get started?
Yes.
Okay. So yesterday we covered the process modeler. Um, and so we covered all of those process elements. Let me know if you need me to repeat anything or if you have any more questions. I'll be more than happy to answer those. And today we're going to go ahead and get started with screens. So like I said yesterday, screens are electronic forms that we're going to build in ProcessMaker. Um, and those are the equivalent of Dynaforms from ProcessMaker 3. Before I get started with those, I did want to show you this slide deck that talks about, or this one slide actually, that talks about the data model in ProcessMaker 4. The way that ProcessMaker 4 handles data is a lot different from ProcessMaker 3. So what happens is for each request of a process, we have a JSON object that holds all of that request data and grows as we go through all of the tasks and elements in the process. So if you are already familiar with JSON objects, this is going to be really easy, and if not, it's pretty easy to learn. So let me go ahead and make this a little bit bigger actually. So the reason why this is relevant today is we're going to actually see this after we build the screen and preview it. So if you see here, I have an example of a screen on this slide, and then below that is the information that is submitted to the request after the user fills out the form and submits the information. So we have a property name for each of those three fields. So we have department, approver, and email, and then in the JSON object for this screen, we also have the property, the properties department, approver, and approver email. And each of these values for these properties are coming from this screen here. So in ProcessMaker 4, all you need to remember is that any data that comes into the request through a form, through a script, through a call to a REST endpoint, all of that is going to be stored in the request JSON object for you to use later on. So if you want to autofill forms, you just remember the property that stores that value, enter the property name into the variable name field, and then you can autofill forms like that, and we'll cover that today. So here's an example of a script task. So we can see from the code it's going to return two properties, variable one and manager. And so if we look below in the JSON object, we can see now that in addition to the information from the screen, we also have the information that was returned by the script. So those two properties, variable one and manager, are also below in the JSON object for the request. So then finally, when we reach that end event, we have this complete JSON object that stores all of the information entered into the request. So it's going to include the information from the screen, this script, and then all of the other screen scripts, whatever else from the request. So all incoming data is stored in this JSON object. The other thing to note about this JSON object is that it's schemaless as well. And I'll come back to this slide later on as we go through the course just to show you what I'm talking about. But it's very useful to have a very good understanding of how these JSON objects work to be able to better manipulate and work with data in your requests. So it's just some useful information for you. All right, and now let me go into my environment here. All right, now let me go into the designer here. And so yesterday we were in processes, so today I'm going to go into screens here. All right, so here's a list of all of the screens in my environment. If we look at the top tab, we can see we have both screens and categories. Categories work pretty much the same way as processes, so I'm not going to go into too much detail there. And so the other thing to note about screens that's really different from ProcessMaker 3 is that screens can be used in any process. They're not unique to the process. So we have screens that can be used in any process. Scripts can be used in any process. And pretty much anything else can be used in any process. Screens and scripts are the two main ones to note here though. All right. So the first thing I'm going to do is I am going to create a new screen. So I'm going to create a new screen by clicking the plus screen button up here. And then I'm going to name this leave of absence request form July training. And so we have 4 types of screens. We have the form screen, which allows user input. We have a display, which is used only to display information, does not allow input. We have email type, which you send along with email tasks or action by email, and then advanced type screens, which you can build from scratch using Bootstrap and JavaScript or HTML. All right, so I'm going to choose the form type because I do want to allow input from the end user. Next, I can enter a short description. So I'll just write something, employees fill this form out to request a leave of absence from their supervisor. And then here we can choose a category. I'm just going to choose human resources. Again, we can use more than one category if we so choose, but I'm just going to leave this as human resources. So I'm going to go ahead and save this, and this is going to take me to the screen builder. So the screen builder is laid out a lot like the process designer. So we have the controls here in the left panel. We have the basic design in the middle, and then after we click on an element, we'll see the configuration show up in this right-hand side. So the first thing I'm going to do is I am going to add a rich text control to this screen to add a title here. So I'm going to put in leave of absence request form. So this is a rich text field. This only displays text to the user. It does not allow input. We're going to use line input controls to allow the user to enter information. So this here in this rich text field, I'm just going to enter a title for the form. So this rich text field, because you can see we have this rich text editor, this takes over from the title, subtitle, and label controls from ProcessMaker 3. So rich text can be used to display pretty much any text in almost any formatting you want. And you can also use HTML here. If you're looking in the configuration on the right panel, you can see here we have those P tags for the HTML. So we can also enter HTML here. Sorry, I'm just going to be a little bit slow. That should have worked. I don't know what I did wrong there. Maybe. Yeah, it's bolded here. I don't know why it's not bolded in the preview. But you can also enter HTML there. And then what you can also do is center this text, and I'm going to make this a heading 2. Actually, that looks smaller. I'm going to leave this as a heading 1 maybe. All right. So we have the title of the form there. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a section called Employee Details. And I want to make this a heading too. All right. So we have the title of the form as well as a title for the section that they're going to fill out. So the next thing I want to do is I'm going to add a line input control. So I'm going to enter that here. So I'm going to click on this and we see a bunch more options here. So the first thing we see is a variable name. So before I get started with the configuration, what I'm going to do with this field is I'm going to use JavaScript to get the current date from the server. So this is going to be used to display that date to the end user. So for the variable name, I'm going to put in current date. And so again, if we're thinking about that JSON object, this is the property name that will store the value of the current date. Here I have the label, which I'm just going to put in as current date. Not too different from ProcessMaker so far. I'm just going to leave this as text right now. We have some validation rules. I'll cover those later. And then we have read-only mode. Because I don't want the end user to be able to change this current date at all, I'm going to put this as read-only. All right, and then I'm going to come back to calculated properties, which is how I'm going to use JavaScript to and input the current date here. Now we have some other configuration options and I'll show you those in just a second. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add a couple of fields for the employee to enter their name, their email, title, and department. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually want to split the next row into 2 columns. So, excuse me.
We're having good sound.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes,
Okay, sorry about that. All right, so I'm going to split the next row into 2 columns. So I did that with this multi-column table control here. So this works just like ProcessMaker 3, and if you're familiar with Bootstrap, you'll already know this. But in this row, you can only have a maximum of 12 columns. If you try to go over 12, it will just cut off whatever is after 12. So just keep that in mind. In this case, I'm going to leave this as 2 columns, but later on I'm going to show you how to divide it into further columns. But for now, all I need is 2 columns here. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to enter a line input control where the end user can enter their name. So I'm going to change the name of this variable to employee name here. Yeah, I'll label this employee name as well. I'll leave the data type to text. Here I can add some validation rules. So let me go ahead and show you how to add a rule. So when I add a rule, it takes me to this drop down where I can select from some of the rules that have been pre-entered into this drop down. So for example, if I want to make this field required, I'm going to go down and look for the required rule, and I can enter it and make it required there. We can also enter a condition if we wanted to. So if we did required if, we can enter the condition here. So if the variable name is equal to this, then it will be required, for example. Let me delete that. So if you want to see more details about how these validation rules, you can feel free to go into the documentation to learn how all each of these operate. The other thing I did want to show you though is you can also use regular expressions as well to enter your own validation rules. You just need to know the pattern there, and then you can use regular expressions to input your own validation rules as well. I'm just going to get rid of that. I just want to play an old required validation rule here. All right, so now the employee name field is required, so they are not able to submit the form unless they fill out this field. Okay, so that brings me to the next field, which is going to be the email field. So here I'm going to name this variable employee email. I'll label it employee email. It's still going to be text, so I don't need to worry about the data type there. Here I can look for the email validation rule, and it will ensure that an email address is entered there in the correct format. We have read only. So here in the configuration, I can enter some placeholder text. So this is just going to input gray text into the field here. So I can just put in, put in your work email, for example. And then if you can see on your screens, we get this very light gray text here. So let me just check the preview. So here it says put in your work email, and that gives them an idea of how to fill out that this field there. We can also add some helper text. So I'm going to write in, please enter your work email. And then we get a little tiny gray message underneath the field. So the placeholder text and the helper text are there to give the end user a hint as how to fill out that particular field without inputting any values. All right. Let me get rid of those actually. No, I'll just leave them. All right, so the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add another field where they can input their title. So again, I'm going to go through the variable name is going to be employee title. The label is going to be also employee title, nothing too special here. Data type is going to be text as usual. Let's just look at some of these other options. So we looked in the configuration, which only holds the placeholder and helper text. Here we have the design, so we can change the text color of the label. So you can see here it just changed the label to blue. We can also change the background color of the control. So here we have this gray color now. So just some quick and easy design options there. Again, in ProcessMaker 4, you can change the CSS of the design. So I'm going to also show you how to do that later on. And then here we have this advanced part. So what we can do here is we can enter a default value for this control. So what I can do here is I can enter either a request variable or a magic variable, and I'll show you what those are in a second, or I can enter some JavaScript like so. So I can make a calculation here, and then that will calculate the default value of this control. So let me go ahead, and I'm going to actually use this variable user.title to input the user's title. So what this user variable does is it gets the user information from the user's profile, and it's going to be the user who is currently assigned to the task. And then we have the title that's coming from that user information. So let me just show you a little bit more information about that. So in ProcessMaker 4, we call these magic variables. And we have two types, one that returns the user data about the user assigned to the current task. And we have another one that returns the request data. So let me go ahead and search for magic variables here. So I'm in the documentation right now. And I'm going to look up this first page called Reference Magic Variables in ProcessMaker Assets. So let me scroll down to where we can actually see the content. So you can see here we have the user data stored in this JSON object here. So calling this user property here or user variable is going to pull the data in the user's profile. So I used user.title here to pull the user's title from their user profile. And you can also do the same thing with the request variable. So here we have this request variable that contains all of the basic information about the current request. So we also have this user ID property that's going to store the user ID of the requester. So we're going to actually use this as well later on in a data connector. So I'll explain that later on. But for now, all we need to know is that this user magic variable pulls information from the user's profile. And I can also use this to actually autofill the employee name field as well. So let me go back into the configuration for this. And so I'm going to enter again that user magic variable. And then if I go back and I look for the property that stores their name, I'm going to look here. So I've got that full name there. So I'm going to enter dot full name. And so that's how we can use magic variables to autofill these fields in our screens. All right, so let me go back into employee title. And so we have these two other advanced options here. We have visibility rule, which I'll show you how to use in a bit. And then we also have CSS selector name, which I'll also show you how to use when we cover the CSS option. All right, so next we have I'm gonna give them a field where they can enter the department that they're in. And for this, I'm going to use a drop down. So if you want to add a drop down to your screen, what you're going to do is you're going to add a select list control. So I'm going to drag this down here and I've got the select list control now. And I'm going to go ahead and click on this. So I'm going to change the variable name here to employee department. Then I'm going to have the label here, again, employee department. I don't need a validation rule. So let me go into, configuration, placeholder helper, don't need that. But what's special here is this data source configuration. So I'm going to go ahead and open it. So what this data source means is how we're going to input the values into this control here for those options. So we're basically determining how we're going to pull options into the drop down. So I'm going to first show you how to just manually provide your own values. And later on I'll show you how to use request data and a data connector to pull in values from either the request or from a call to a REST endpoint that you're going to make within the screen. These two are actually going to come later on. They're not going to be covered today, but I'm going to cover them So don't worry about that. For today, I'm just going to stick with this provide values option here. And so what I'm going to do with this is I'm going to manually provide the values that are going to appear in this dropdown. All right, so to add those options, you can see this option header below. And we have this tiny little plus icon, so I'm going to go ahead and click it here. And then here we can add the value of the option that will be stored in the variable, and then the content, which is actually the label that you're going to see for that option in the dropdown. So because these are going to hold the departments, I'll just put in the value as 1 just to show you the difference. And then the content is going to be sales. So let me add another one for good measure. So 2 will be human resources, for example. All right, so let me go ahead and preview this. So if I go to the employee department drop down here, I can see those 2 options, sales and human resources. But if I click on sales and I look in the data preview, we can see below here in this lower right corner that the value of that employee department variable is 1. So the value that we put in, 1 and 2, are the values of the variable here, and then the content is the label of those options in the dropdown. So that's one way I can provide values for this dropdown. The other way is to edit it as a JSON object. So I'm going to show you guys how to do that as well. All right, so this is impossible to see right now. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to click this square button here, and that's going to give me this bigger script editor. So I'm going to just copy and paste this first option here. Actually, I'm going to add it like this. And then I'm going to just go to other times. So I've added 5 options. And I'm just going to go ahead and edit this. So this is just an additional way to enter those options depending on what you're more comfortable with. It also makes it really easy to copy and paste options from another JSON object as well. Okay, I accidentally closed that, but here we go. Finance, legal, I'll have 4. And then next will be administration with a value of 5, for example. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and close that. And so if I go back and I click this edit as option list link below, it's going to take me back to these lists of options here. So if I preview it, we can see now I've got 5 options: sales, human resources, finance, legal, and admin.
I have a quick question for you.
Yes.
So can you name that instead of like 1, 2, 3, 4, can you name it sales, human resources like that, or does it have to be a number?
No, it doesn't have to be a number. I just showed that for you because just to show you the difference between the value and the content, but
Okay.
it could be pretty much anything you want.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so we saw those values. So, okay, so the next thing I'm going to show you is how to change. So if you're familiar with ProcessMaker 3, you had like a whole radio list option as well as the drop-down option and then like the checkbox group. It's the select list control is all 3 of those controls in one. So if we wanted to switch between those types, we can use this show control as. So we could do a drop-down or multi-select or a radio or checkbox group. So I'm going to change this to a radio selection, and you can see it's already rendered differently here. So this is in the case we want to leave it to only select one option. But what we can do is we can also allow multiple selections with this control as well. So when I allow multiple selections, you're going to see it changes into a checkbox group. So if I preview this, you can see here, I can now select multiple options. So the other important thing to note is when you change this type from a multi-select to single value and vice versa, the type of data that's stored is going to be different. So with a multi-select, it's going to store an array in that employee department variable. So if you're looking at the data preview right now, you can see an array that stores all of the options I've selected. But if you were to leave it as one option is only selectable as in a drop down or a radio group, it will store it as a string. So here we have multiple options available, so we have an array. But if I change it back to just only allowing one selection, you can see here it's now stored as a string. So this is really important to keep in mind in the case you're using a select list to determine maybe the gateway conditions, or you might be using it in another condition somewhere else. Just keep in mind those data types there, because if you're going to try to use the value from a select list control as a string in the gateway condition, that's not going to work, because if you have multiple selections, you need to write it as an array. So that can be easy to get confused sometimes, so I just wanted to point that out. All right, so I'm going to leave this as a drop down. And then next we can determine the type of value returned. So in the case you want to return multiple values with one option, you can choose to return an object there. And I'll actually show you how this works later on. In our case, we only want to return a single value, so we can do that as well. In our case, it doesn't really matter because we only do have one single value for those options anyway. But in the case you are using a REST endpoint to maybe populate these options, each option might have multiple values associated with it. So in that case, you might want to return an object, and I'll show you an example of that when we get to data connectors. So I'm going to actually come back to that. And then, so that concludes this data source configuration part. I am going to come back to this control when we cover some other topics, but for now we can just manually provide those values. And then the design and advanced section is not any different, so I'm not going to review those. So that's the end of my employee details section. So the next thing I'm going to add is a section where the employee can enter the details regarding their leave of absence. So I'm going to go ahead and add another rich text field for them to add another subtitle for that section. So I'm going to just input leave details here. And then I'll bold this, heading 2 there. So we've got that leave details section now. And so I'm going to add a rich text field here. And what this is going to do is it is going to display the amount of leave the employee has remaining. So if you recall from our process model, and actually let me quick open this for a second. So if we recall from our process model, we're making a call to a REST endpoint before we allow the requester to fill in the leave of absence request form. So what we're going to do is, with the data we get back from this call, we're going to autofill the leave of absence request form. So, and I didn't want to pull a rich text. I wanted a line input. So with this new line input, what we're going to do is we're going to populate this field with the leave remaining that we get back from that call to the REST endpoint. So I'm going to put in the variable name here, leave remaining. And this is going to be the name of the property that stores leave remaining. And we'll see that in the response from the call to the REST endpoint. So I'll come back to this and just show you how everything is connected. But I did want to just tell you that this is coming from the property name, from the response to the call, from the call to the collection record. So we'll see this in the response object, and I'll point that out to you when we cover data connectors. So then here I have the label, leave remaining. So then again, when the end user opens this screen, they're going to see the amount of leave they have remaining, so they know how much they can request in the case they want to max out and take the rest of their leave days. Data type, I'll put it as integer, because it's going to be a number of days. I don't need validation rules. I am going to leave this as read only. Another way we can do this to display values, so obviously we're just using this leave remaining line input control to display the number of leave days they have remaining, which is why I'm using this as read only, so they can't input it and change it. But we can also do this with a rich text control. So let me just show you how you would do that with a rich text control. I did it with a line input because I actually prefer the look of a line input control. But in a rich text control, what I could do is first I'll add the leave remaining label. And then here I can use mustache syntax that includes the property name to display that leave remaining value. So all you need to know is the property name and then put that within mustache syntax, and then you'll be able to display that value in a rich text control. And I'll actually review this later on, and you'll see this in action during the process as well. But I did want to point this out to you right now. But I only use the line input control because I prefer the look of it. I think it looks more organized and just better than plain text. But of course, you can also edit the appearance of that rich text control the way you want. But I just like the look of the line input. All right, so the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to divide the next row into 3 columns. So I'm going to use a multi-column table control here. And then I am actually going to divide this into 3 columns. So there's 2 ways to do that with a multi-column table control. I can use this way through the interface. So I'm going to just remove one of those columns, and then the column width needs to be 4. I'm going to divide it into 3 equal columns, so they're all going to be 4, 4, 4. Again, you can only have them add up to 12. So that's one way, as I can do that through the button here, or I can do it through a JSON object. So if I toggle this show in JSON format option here, it's going to show me the options in JSON format. So I'm just going to add a third one. So I'm going to change the col span there, and I'll change the value here so it's its own unique column, and then I'll save that. And now I have 3 columns of equal width here. So you can do that either with a JSON object like I just did, or you can also use it through these buttons as well. Okay, so in this column, I'm going to put in a place where the end user can enter the dates of their leave, as well as we're going to calculate the total leave for them automatically between those two dates. So I am going to drag a date picker control and drop it down here. And this is where they're going to pick the date when their leave starts. So I'm going to put in leave start right now. And I'll label that leave start as well. And then here I have two options for the date picker control. I can either choose a date or a date time. In this case, I'm just going to put in a date because I only have some very simple JavaScript to do the difference between two dates. But you could also use a date time there to choose the date and the time when they are going to take their leave. All right, so I don't want a validation rule. I don't want it read only. In the configuration, we can enter a date for when they can take their leave. So I could actually use the current date variable here in mustache syntax. So then the minimum date would be the current date that I'm going to calculate here. So they wouldn't be able to select anything before today, which makes sense. Or if you could also put in a date here. So if I didn't only wanted them to be able to choose for this year, I can put it in at like so. So those are two ways. You can either use a variable in mustache syntax or an actual date and time here. And then so this determines the range of dates where they're allowed to select values from. And then below we have the placeholder text and helper text that I showed you before. Then we have the design and then the advanced section here. All right. So I'm going to add another date picker where they can choose their leave, the end of their leave. So I'm going to put this as leave end, and I'll put this leave end as well. Then that's going to be a date. And I don't really need anything else for this. Now the last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to put in their total leave here. So I'm going to use a line input control here again. Here I'm going to put in the total leave variable. And this will be an integer because it'll be the number of days. And I don't really need anything else there. I could make it read only because I'm going to calculate it. But whatever. Okay. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add a place for them where they can check their reason why they're taking leave. So I'm going to put in a select list control here, and this time we're going to display radio buttons rather than a drop down. So first I'm going to put in the variable name here, leave type. I'm going to put in the label, which is reason for leave. And then I don't need any validation rules. I don't need any placeholder or helper text. So I'm going to go straight to the status source, and I'm going to enter these options as a JSON object. I'm just going to copy and paste this from another location so you don't have to see me type this all out. So just give me a second while I get that text. There we go. And I just got to delete these brackets here. All right. So I've got those options now, and I am going to change this to a radio checkbox group. So we can see that here, and what I'm going to teach you how to do with CSS is display this horizontally, so stay tuned for that. So now they're able to select their reason for leave. But in the case they select other, what I want to do is I want to show a text area where they can enter some more information about why they're taking leave. So to do that, first I'm going to add a text area control underneath. So I'm going to click on the text area here. I'm going to name this variable more info. Then the label is going to be more information. I don't need any validation rules or read only. I will enter some placeholder text or helper text. If you selected other, please provide, oops, more information about the reason for the leave of absence. All right. So next, what we can do with this rich text checkbox is we can change this to a rich text editor for the end user. So the end user, when they fill out a form, they'll have all of those formatting options. So you can see here they can do bold, you know, whatever else, enter an image, enter a link, if you did want to provide them some options there. However, if you leave this rich text control off, you can just provide the number of rows where they have available space to enter information, but it's just going to be plain text. They won't have that toolbar up there. All right, so then the next thing I wanted to do is I'm going to add a visibility rule to this control so that it's hidden unless the reason for leave selected is other. So I'm going to go into this advanced section here and I'm going to enter a visibility rule. So if the reason for leave is other, then we will display this more information control. So the thing I need to take note here is the variable name of this reason for leave field and then the value of the option. So the value of this other option is simply other. So we have that lowercase here. So let me enter that into the visibility rule. So the variable name again was leave type. I'm going to have that equal to other, which was the value. So if we go ahead and we look at the preview, we can see that that more info text area is hidden. So if I click on these other options, it doesn't show up. But if I click on that other option, we can see now it's displayed. So that's how visibility rules work, is if you want to hide a control unless a certain condition is met, you can enter a visibility rule into that control's configuration. So the next thing I'm going to do is I am going to add a file upload control. So if they have a doctor's note or something else they need to provide with the leave request, they can do that. So I'm going to drag and drop this file upload control to the bottom of the form. And we can see that here. So I'll just change the label. I'll put it upload related documents. And then here is the name. So that's going to be the name of the document. And so what you can do is you can use this to be able to download the document later, which is what I'm going to show you when we build the review screen after we take a break. So I'm going to just name this leave docs. It's essentially the property name of the file. It basically functions as the variable name for the rest of the controls as we saw earlier. So here I'm able to upload those documents, and then finally I'm going to add a submit button. So I'm going to add the submit button down there. I'm just going to leave the label as submit. Here we can choose a variable name. So what we could do for this button is when they click submit, the variable name of the button will change. So this submit button functions as a button control like in ProcessMaker 3. So you can, in the configuration, if you choose it to a regular button, it won't submit the form. What it will do is it will just change the variable name and enter the value for that variable if it's clicked. So if you want someone to click a button and then a script is run, or if you want them to click a button and then like a visibility rule is now met, you can do it that way. In my case, I just wanted to act like a normal submit button so that when someone clicks the button, the form is submitted. And in that case, if it's just a simple submit button, you don't actually need to enter a variable name and a value. The form will just be submitted. So let me go ahead and save this because I want to save my changes here. And I just finished the basic design of the leave of absence request form. So I'm going to show you guys how to add a sort of JavaScript in the background so you can make some calculations. I'm going to show you guys how to add CSS to this, and I'll also show you how the screen preview works so we can actually preview what information is being submitted with the form. So I think right now is a good time to take a 10-minute break. All right, see you guys in 10 minutes. Okay, so I left off at the basic design. There is one thing I did want to show you guys. So for the default value, I made a tiny mistake. I forgot to put it in mustache syntax. So before it just showed the text there. So if you just wanted the actual value put in there, then you could do that. But this mustache syntax is actually what pulls in the value of the property rather than just the text there. So just wanted to point that out so you don't do anything wrong. Okay, but other than that, the design is finished. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to show you how to use well, first, let me just show you the preview of the screen, and then we'll cover calculated properties and CSS. As for watchers, we're going to come back to this at a later session because we need to know how a few other things work in ProcessMaker before we actually cover this. So let me go to the preview now. So you can see here, we don't yet have a current date. I still need to enter the JavaScript for that. And then here in this employee name field, I can, enter my name. And then if we take a look at the data preview here, we can actually see the name of the property that I just entered, so that's employee name, as well as the value I just entered, which of course is my name. So then as we go out and fill in the rest of this form, so I'll enter my email address there. We see that validation rule come into play, but then when we enter the full valid email, it goes away. So then again, if we look at the data preview, we can see the values that will be submitted with the form if I were to submit it at this point. So this is really useful for testing purposes. Here we sort of have a basic design of the screen, so not too many things will go wrong here. But if you wanted to check to make sure that your calculated properties are working, your select list is working, everything like that, it would be, this data preview is a great way just to make sure everything in the background that you might not necessarily see in the form design is working properly.
So I thought the employee title was going to auto-populate.
It will. We just need to run a request first. So actually, let me just show you how that works. It's not going to autofill in the design because no one is really assigned to a task at this point, so there's no values for the user variable that pulls in that user information. Someone has to be assigned to a task or a start event to pull in that information. But if I assign it to a process, so let me go into the designer. I'm going to go into this blank process map. And so I'm just going to assign the screen to a task quickly. So I already assigned it here to test out those default values because I thought I was like, oh, I think I did that wrong. So if you populate it here, or sorry, assign it to a task here, and then if I open a request of this, and I know I'm going through this fast, but I'm going to do this more slowly when we actually finish automating. So when I open the form here, that is actually auto-populated. It's just you need to have a user assigned to that task to have those values there. So in that particular case, you do need to run a request of the process to test that out. But as far as the magic variables go, they're going to work. And then if we actually look in the data too, it will show us down. Oh, where is it? Oh, maybe not. Interesting. Anyway, so here we have that. Oh yeah, this data tab isn't input with this screen data until after I submit it. But yeah, here it's being auto-populated from that screen. It just won't show up in the design quite yet because we do need someone actually assigned to the task. So sorry about that confusion. All right. So I'm just going to continue filling this out. Well, I'm not going to bother with every single thing, but we can see here all of that data that we're inputting is going to be part of this data preview. So this is going to be the JSON object that's submitted with the form after the employee clicks that submit button. All right. And the rest of these all work pretty much the same way. And I'm actually going to come back to this data input section and the vocabulary section. This is I'm going to come back to in the last session when we actually cover vocabularies. Again, vocabularies, what they're going to do is they're going to verify the data entered into the process, but I'm going to come back to that. And this data input section, I will also show you when we actually build the review screen for this right after we finish with this leave of absence request form. We are not able to upload documents to a screen preview. It's just not available in preview mode, but if I click the submit button here, if everything is working right and the end user is able to submit the form, we're going to see the pop-up up here. But let's say they didn't fill in the employee name will be auto-populated, but if they delete that value for whatever reason, you can see if I click the submit button, I don't see the pop-up. So that means the form isn't submitted. So that's something else that's important to test in the screen preview. Oh, and also that visibility rule here I can test as well. So we saw that was working from before. But if I, now if I put in a full name here, now I'm able to submit the form. So that also is something else important to remember about the screen preview is this pop-up here that will show you if it's submitted. Do you guys have any other questions before I go over calculated properties?
No.
Okay. So that's the basic screen design, and I know I didn't cover all of those controls yet, but I'm going to come back to those after we finish building the review screen. So with the review screen, I'll also show you how to auto-populate fields from a previous form. It's basically the same as ProcessMaker 3, so it'll only take us about 10 minutes. But I will come back to the controls we haven't seen yet. So just hang tight for those. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to move on to calculated properties. So from ProcessMaker 3 to add a JavaScript to the form, we used that JavaScript option in the Dynaform settings. But here we're going to do calculated properties. And one major difference between that JavaScript functionality and calculated properties is that we're only able to calculate the value of one property at a time. So with the JavaScript from ProcessMaker 3, you are able to enter JavaScript for the entire form. You just basically entered whatever coding you wanted, and then it returned, a bunch of values at once if that's what you wanted to do, etc., etc. But in this case, we're only able to calculate one property at a time, and you'll see what I mean when I create a new one. So again, I'm going to click on this Calcs button here, and then I'm going to click on this plus property button to create a new calculated property. So the first calculated property I want to do is that current date property. So if I remember from the screen design, the variable name was current date. So I'm going to enter that current date here into the first field. Here I can enter a description, so I'm putting auto fills the current date and actually just the date into the current date field. So then down here is where we can enter the formula. So there are two formulas we can use. We can do this basic mathematical formula here where I can just enter property names. So if I had a property called total and I wanted to calculate the tax from that total, I could do it like so, as long as those properties will be given values at an earlier point in the screen. I can also use magic variables here. So that used to be the old version of the labs and stuff. But if I could do that here with the magic variables to auto-populate whatever property I'm going to calculate. But in this case, we're going to go ahead and use JavaScript. So I'm going to make sure I click this JavaScript button here. I just wanted to point that out. That a lot of people get confused and they forget to change the mode. So some people enter JavaScript into this option here, and that's not going to work because it won't parse this as JavaScript. It's just going to parse it as, the screen properties. But if you want to make sure it's going to parse it as JavaScript, you need to make sure you click this JavaScript button here. And that's, to the far right side of the formula field. I know it's pretty small. All right, so into the formula field, I'm going to enter the JavaScript I want to use. This JavaScript is available to you in the lab, so if you don't know how to write JavaScript, I'm assuming you guys do, but in the case you don't, it's here for you in the lab if you want to just copy and paste it. It's a very simple line of JavaScript where I'm just returning the date from the server. So I got the date. I always forget this name every single time I train. The date, it's not a function, but anyway, so it's going to return the date from the server, the date constructor. There we go. So something that's also really cool about these calculated properties is that we can see some information about the code. And it will validate the code as we go through as well. So it will show you some red in this bar here if you wrote something wrong. But it also gives you some basic information and how to use that function if you were to hover over it. So we use this date constructor here to retrieve the date from the server. We're going to transform the object data to JSON. Then we're going to slice it. So that means I'm just going to return the first 10 characters because I put in 0 and 10 into those parameters there. And then we're going to replace the dashes with slashes just because we prefer that formatting. But again, just a very basic JavaScript to return that date. So now I'm going to save that. And now I'm going to preview it, and we can already see here that the current date is now populated into that field here. So this is something you can do in the case you want to auto-populate the date into the form. And then if we look at the data preview here, we can also see that the current date is like, like as we see in the current date field displayed. And something that's also useful about this data preview is that if we did have an error or if our calculated properties weren't working correctly, they might not be displayed in the field, but we would also be able to see the maybe the error message or the wrong value in the data preview section as well. So it's just kind of an extra way to know, what's going on in the background. And sometimes you might even use calculated properties to calculate a property that you won't display. So in the case you have a calculated property that you are adding JavaScript to because you just need to calculate something in the background, you don't have to display those properties, but to make sure that they're working in the background of the screen, that's what the data preview is useful for. So you don't have to, add a field to display the value and delete it later. It's all right here in the data preview. Okay. So the next property I'm going to create is going to calculate the total leave between the two dates selected. So I'm just going to point this out again. So that property name we're going to calculate is going to come from this variable name field. So if you recall from the current date calculated property, we use the variable name here to input it into that property name field in the calculated property configuration. And then here we're going to enter the total leave. So I'm just going to copy that. I'll make a new calculated property, and then I'm going to enter total leave there. So I'm going to enter a short description here about what it does. So calculates the total days of leave between the dates selected. And now I'm going to just make sure I'm going to use my JavaScript there. And then so I am going to enter the code I have for this field. So this, again, this code is available for you in the labs for this module. But I'll just kind of quick walk you through the code here. So here I'm just creating JavaScript variables that will pull in the values from the screen. I didn't actually need to do this. I could have just referred to it using this.leaveStart. But I don't know, it just made my life easier to do it that way. So here we're just creating a new date with that leave start. And so the important thing I wanted to point out to you is within this parameter for that date constructor is if you want to pull values from the current screen. So in this case, we don't know what the leave start is until the end user fills it out in the form. You would use this. So this dot the property name. So if you remember from the form, the property name or the variable name of the leave start date picker is called leave start. The variable name of the leave end field is leave end. So we're using this dot leave start and this dot leave end to pull those values from the screen so we can use it in this JavaScript. So this part is probably the most important part of this code because the rest of it is just a very basic JavaScript to calculate those two dates or the difference between those two dates. So then here I pull the dates that they selected into leave start and leave end, and that is going to store it in a special date format where I can calculate those values. So it's going to calculate the number of milliseconds between the leave end and leave start dates. Then I'm going to divide that by 1000 to calculate the number of seconds, and then I convert the seconds into days there. And then I'm going to return days plus 1 because it's going to, the time difference between those two dates is actually going to include the date that the leave starts on. So normally it would just be the date between the leave start and the leave end without including either of those dates, but in this case we did need to include the date when the leave starts. So that's going to be +1 there. Now, this is just very basic JavaScript for a simple example. If you were to implement this in real life, you would need to account for weekends. You'd probably want to include the time. So all of that stuff you can just look up online, and there's a ton of resources for calculating those values. I just did the dates here because it's easier that way. All right, so now if I test that out in the preview, and actually click and select those dates. So it calculates that like so. And I can't change it as the end user. So the total leave is going to be 5 days there. And that's all there is to calculated properties. I just wanted to show you 2 basic examples of that, but if you know JavaScript, you can do a bunch of stuff with those. So the next thing I'm going to show you is how to customize the look of the screen using CSS. So just as a reminder, in the labs, you'll see that JavaScript code that you can copy and paste into your own screen. You'll see the CSS I'm going to use right now. So all of that is available to you in ProcessMaker University. And before we sign off today, I'm going to just show you which labs that we covered today as far as the material is concerned. So if you want to complete those on your own time, you're certainly encouraged and welcome to. So let me just go ahead and open the CSS editor here. So here's where I can enter the CSS, where I can customize the look of the screen in a more complex and customizable way. Because this gives us a lot more options than just the design options in the control configuration. So again, I'm just copy and pasting this code. Again, it's available in the Building a Screen lab, so the first lab in this module. So I'm doing a bunch of things here, and let me just start off with the stuff up here where I'm changing the appearance of the entire screen. So here I'm using this div.page, so I'm able to change the look of the entire screen. So if you wanted to change the background color like I'm doing here of the whole form, you use div.page. And then the property name I'm changing is the background color. So I changed the background color to light blue. And I actually added some padding here because sometimes the CSS of the individual controls, they kind of go outside of the border of the whole page. So just to make sure everything is covered in light blue, I expanded the border of the page by 20 pixels in this case. Then down here, I am adding a logo to the page's CSS like so. There are a couple ways to add a logo if you wanted to in your screens. This is one of them by using CSS and then the URL where the image is hosted. What you can also do is you can upload an image from your hard drive to the image control and add it that way. And then also you can use HTML and the URL where the image is hosted in a rich text control using HTML. So those are 3 ways to add a logo. It's through CSS, the image control, and through a rich text control. So just those, that's a huge request that we get from people all the time. Wanted to point that out. So here I'm just using CSS. I have the source URL of that image put here. And then I'm just making sure that the logo doesn't repeat in the background. I'm determining the size of that image. So I decided 100 by 100 pixels, and also where that logo is going to be located in the page. So let's just see those changes here. So that's going to be the background color and the logo. So I'm going to check the preview, and we can see here the background color is now light blue, and I see the ProcessMaker logo in the upper right corner. So that's some of the changes I've made to the entire screen as a whole. Now if I go back into the design, you can see here I'm using this label. And what I'm doing is I'm bolding all of the labels in the form. So normally they're of normal font weight, which is not bolded or italicized. In this case, if I prefer the labels of each control to be bolded, I can do that using CSS like so. So I'm just saying that every label of every control is going to be bolded. So if we actually look here in the preview, we can see that all of these are now bold where they used to be normal before. Okay. So this next thing I wanted to point out to you is pretty important. So you recall in the advanced section of the line input configuration, we had a CSS selector field. So here we're using those CSS selectors to sort of select a certain control within the form and then change the CSS of that particular control. So I haven't added those selectors yet. But what I'm going to do here is I'm going to change the label of the email control to uppercase, and then with the radio button control, what I'm going to do is I'm going to display those horizontally. So let me go ahead and go into the control configuration and change that CSS selector. Before I do that, let me just point out the way it looks now. So we have employee email all in lowercase. But if I go into the advanced configuration here, and then the selector name is going to be email. Now if I preview it, that CSS will be supplied, and then the label and the helper text are now in uppercase. So if I look back at the CSS, that selector name was email. So now after changing the selector name in the control configuration, that text transform is going to be applied to that email control. So I'm going to do the same thing for the radio button control to display those options horizontally. So I'm going to go down here. I'm going to go to the advanced section down here and enter that selector name, which in this case is radio. So you can see it already changed and applied that CSS to the preview here. And if we wanted to just double check that appearance, we can look here in the preview as well. So there, here with that selector, I'm displaying that inline, and then the rest of these are also for that same radio button. So I needed to sort of separate those, because if you simply do display inline without manipulating the appearance of those objects or the options, excuse me, they're going to appear all smushed together. So I put in some margins to separate those options. And then I also displayed them all together in a block. And then I also had to change back the labels of each of those options back to normal, because this label, generic label selector, changed every single label to bold, so it bolded all of the options for the radio button as well, so I had to change it back to normal. So something, if you aren't familiar with dev tools, is if you need to manipulate a very specific part of the CSS, such as these radio button options, you can go into the preview, check out the dev tool, so F12. And then you can also use the selector here in the elements part and just select those. Whoops, wrong part. So then here it's label.form check label, that where you can just go to a particular element in the screen design as well. So you can use that CSS selector option for the whole control itself, as we did with the email and this radio control. But in the case that doesn't get specific enough for you, for if you want to manipulate a certain element within the control, you can also do it this way with the dev tools. Okay. So that's all there is to CSS. Again, that CSS is available to you in the lab just to copy and paste and see how that works, backwards engineer it. So that actually wraps up the design of this leave of absence request form. So I'm going to go ahead and save it. Versioning again is available for these screens if you want, so you can do the version name and then add a description if you want to, and then go into the screen configuration and you'll see the versions there, just like I showed you for processes yesterday. We can also export the screen. So if I click this button here, it's going to export it as a JSON file. So just remember from yesterday is that any element exported from ProcessMaker is going to be in a JSON file. That includes processes and screens. So if you have processes and screens that have similar names, such as in this case, I recommend just creating separate folders on your hard drive for processes and for screens so you don't get them mixed up. It'll make them a lot easier to find. Okay.
Oui. I have one question, please.
Mm-hmm.
On ProcessMaker 3, we are using hidden variable. Is it always possible on ProcessMaker 4?
You are using what? I missed that word.
Hidden variable.
I'm sorry, I still can't hear that well.
Free, we
Hidden variable. What I would do is I would do a calculated property, but it could be anything. It just could be hidden, hidden, and then you just you don't have a field that displays it, because they're only displayed as long as you have a hidden, or if you have a field with the variable name hidden. So let me just return, like, I don't know, 1. That should work. So then here, I'm not going to name any of these fields with the hidden variable. But if I go into the preview, I still have that value there. So those calculated properties don't have to be assigned to any field. You can just use them to calculate a value and nothing more. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's okay.
Okay.
Sorry for my accent.
Oh, no, it's okay. The audio isn't also very good either. Do you guys have any other questions before we look at the review screen? Okay, doesn't sound like any more questions, but you can stop me at any time. Don't worry. Okay, so what we're going to do now is we're going to build the leave of absence review form. So this is going to be the form that the supervisor will use to review all of the information entered by the employee, and then they'll make that decision whether or not they're going to approve the leave request. So let me go back into screens here. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm actually going to make a copy of that screen so we don't have to rebuild the design. So I'm going to just search for it here, leave of absence request form, July training. I want to delete this one right now. And then so I'm going to look at these options here. So I have this copy option. So I'm going to copy it, and that's going to take me to this screen. I'm going to name this review form instead, and I'll take copy off of that name. And then here I have the type form. So it's going to remain the same type. Category will be human resources. I could change the description, so I'm just going to put in the oh, come on. Supervisors use this form to review the leave requests submitted by their employees. All right. So let me go ahead and save this. So I'm going to search for it in my list of screens here. Let me delete that as well. So I'm going to go in here and edit that. So I just created a copy of that leave of absence request form. So I'm going to just make a few edits here to turn it into a review form. And this will only take me about 5 or 10 minutes. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to change the title there to leave of absence review form. Now, something that's really important to keep in mind, and this is a very easy detail to miss, is that I need to go ahead and delete those calculated properties so they're not recalculated when the supervisor opens the form. Because if we were to leave them as the same, the total leave won't be affected, but the current date will be affected, and it will input the current date from the server when the supervisor opens the form, which is not what we want. We want the date when the requester opened the form. So just to prevent that, all I need to do is delete the calculated properties. But just recall that when you copy a form, the calculated properties are carried over, the CSS is carried over. So if you have things that you don't want to carry over, just make sure to delete those or edit those, especially regarding the calculated properties, because that's something that's pretty easy to miss, and it's easier to catch it now than before when you're running requests of the process to test it out. And I'm just, for good measure, I'm just going to delete all of those, although I could have left the total leave and that hidden property. Doesn't matter. So now the current date is actually going to be populated with the current date from the request form. I'm not going to recalculate that when the supervisor opens the form. So then here I've got that current date property. So all I need to do here to change this into a review form is I can leave all of these variable names the same. These are just going to pull those same values that the end user filled in. So I just make sure that the variable name is the same from the request form, and then it will display that value in the review form. So this works exactly like ProcessMaker 3. Nothing really new to keep in mind there. So the only thing I'm going to do is I'm going to change these line inputs into read only so that the supervisor can only review information but not edit them. Now, so I just did that for those line input controls there. So for this employee department select list, you can see that we're missing that read only checkbox. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually use a rich text field to display the employee department selected. So I'm just going to keep in mind this variable name. I'm going to delete the select list control, and I'm going to replace it with a rich text control, and then I'm going to enter it like I showed you briefly before. So I'm just going to put the label here, employee department, and then I'm going to put in that property name within mustache syntax there. I'm going to just change that to bold because I like that better. And then it will display the employee department that the end user selected in the request form. So if I want to make sure to test that this is working properly, what I can do is I can go into the preview. So obviously we won't have a value to display because it needs to be pulled in from the previous screen. So if we wanted to mock request data in this screen so we can test out controls like this one that depend on a previously input value, I can use this data input section to test that stuff out. So I'm going to enter the employee department, which is the name of the variable that stores that from the request form. And then I'm going to put in the value I want to see, which might be sales. And then we can see here when we test it out that sales value is actually input there. So we just need to enter the variable names and the values that we need to use in a JSON object. So again, that's why I wanted to point out to you that the knowledge of JSON is very, very important in ProcessMaker 4 because you use it all the time to test, the screen out. We see it in the data preview. So all of this background data, request data is stored in that JSON format where we can, as long as we know the property names, we can use those values anywhere else in the process. So that's why it's good to be familiar with those structures. So here I've got that data input in a JSON object, and then I'm able to test the functionality of that rich text control like so. And I'll show you another example of this in a second. So let me just go back into the design, and I'm going to leave the rest of these in read-only mode. That total leave is already in read-only. So this is another select list control. So I need to take note of the variable name here, which is leave type. Then I'm going to delete that select list control and replace it with a rich text control. So I'm going to put in the value there, mustache syntax, and then the property name in the middle. So just like what we've done before. Now, this will be put into read only. Now the other thing we need to do is this is a file upload control, so important to keep in mind that we aren't able to download from the upload control. That's probably pretty obvious, but in ProcessMaker 3 you only need the multiple file uploader to download. In ProcessMaker 4 you just need to make sure you keep this name in mind. So in this case it's leave docs. I'm just going to copy that just in case. And I'm going to delete that file upload control and replace it with a file download control. So all I need to do is make sure that the name I enter here is the same between those two controls so I can download whatever file was previously uploaded. So then I'm going to change the label upload related documents. So that finishes the review part of the leave of absence review form. So the last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add a little section where the supervisor can grant or deny the leave request, and then add any comments if they want to. So I'm going to just add another rich text control here. I'm going to just put in leave approval as the label of this section. I'll bold that, change the heading to 2, and then I'm going to add a multi-column table control to split that into 2 columns like so. And then I'm going to add a checkbox control here for them to approve or deny the request. So I'm going to name this variable leave approval. I'll label it approve leave. And the only thing that's really different about this checkbox control is we can leave it checked by default. In the case we assume that they're going to grant the leave most of the time, I'm just going to leave this unchecked. There's nothing too different about this configuration here. But the thing I wanted to point out is just the data type for a text box control is a Boolean. Obviously there can only be 2 values, true or false, for this control. So if we actually look at the data preview and just check it, we can see that the leave approval is true. If we leave it unchecked, the value is false. This is important Again, because if we use this value in a gateway condition, which we will, we just need to make sure that we're using a Boolean value in that condition rather than accidentally putting true and false as strings. So I'll point this out when we actually write those gateway conditions during the process configuration part. But again, this data preview just comes in extra handy to double check to make sure you're inputting the right values into a condition. So in this case, now we know from the data preview that this checkbox value is a Boolean value. So that way we can make sure that the gateway conditions are written the correct way. All right. And then lastly, I'm just going to add a text area controls where the supervisor can enter any additional comments. So I'm just going to put in the name here, supervisor comments, label is going to be supervisor comments. And that's about it. That's all I need to do to design this leave of absence review form. So the last thing I wanted to do is I just wanted to show you how to test this visibility rule, just to sort of hammer home that data preview part. So if we remember from the advanced section, we put in that visibility rule where leave type equals other. But if we're trying to test this visibility rule, there's no way for the end user to be able to input that leave type. So if I go into preview and I want to enter that leave type value, what I'm going to do is I'm going to input it into the JSON object. So I'm going to put in leave type for the property name, whoops, and then the colon and then the value I'm trying to, of that leave type. So then here if I put in other as the leave type, we can see now that the more information visibility rule is met, and so now it shows up. So again, that data input section is really useful for testing out those visibility rules as well in the case we can't really enter that data into the screen the way it's designed at this point. Just keep in mind the JSON, you need to enter those values in a JSON object. Okay, so that wraps up the review form. So let me go over some of the basic screen configuration options and then we'll wrap up today's session. And tomorrow I'm going to come back to the controls that we haven't used in either of these forms. Do you guys have any questions at this point?
No.
Okay. So let me just show you some of the basic configuration options we have for screens. So I'm just going to go in and put in leave of absence review form here. So again, edit will take me back to the screen editor. We can configure it, copy it like I just showed you, export it and delete it. So let me look at some of these configuration options. So all I have here is just the name, description, and category I can change, but the important thing to note is the version history. So I showed you this sort of in the processes section. This works the same way, where if we want to be able to go back to previous versions of the screen, we can do that by clicking the edit button there, or if we wanted to make a copy of that and restore it to the latest version, we can also do that. So important to know how that screen versioning works if the case you want to use it. That is everything about basic screen configuration. So let me just show you some of the stuff that you can do in ProcessMaker University, and then we can wrap up for today. So let me go into the ProcessMaker developer course here. And so yesterday we finished this process modeling module. So this just allowed you to model the leave of absence process I did yesterday. And then here in this screen building part, you guys can do all three of these labs if you feel like it on your own time. I do highly encourage it, although you guys are coming from ProcessMaker 3, so they really, a lot of this stuff should be sort of intuitive to you because you already have experience there. But in the creating a screen and building a review screen lab, they'll take you through and walk you through all of the stuff I just did today, where you can build your own leave of absence request form, build your own review screen, and then we'll do something I haven't covered, which is building an email template to send in email notifications. So the email screens work pretty much the same way, but there's a very limited number of controls that are available for you, but they function the same way like I showed you today. So then what we're going to cover tomorrow is the rest of those screen controls, and then we'll move on to collections, data connectors, and scripts. So we're going to start doing some pretty advanced stuff tomorrow, where we're going to be calling REST endpoints and then learning how to write our own scripts. So if you guys have no further questions or comments, we can sign off for today.
Okay.
Okay.
For us.
Sorry?
It's okay for us.
Okay, then I'll see you. Have a great day, and I'll see you guys at the same time tomorrow.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.